Welcome back to another episode of Railroad Empires. How we're building them. Tonight is episode number 5, and as you can see by me hanging out under the layout tonight, it's going to be electrical. We're going to be talking about bus wires, feeder wires, and all that other good jazz that brings us into getting power to our layouts. As always, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe if you think we're worthy. We haven't had any questions over the last few episodes, so we're going to just go ahead and jump right in with Lloyd.
Good evening. First, I'll start by telling you guys that the system I use is NCP. Okay. Can you hear me better? No, it's in my head. Hold on. Can you hear me?
Nope.
Now? Better? Okay.
Oh, that's probably the problem. Okay. Okay, that's good. I just got to my desk. Mike, that's why. Okay, how's this? That better?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about what system I use. It's the NCE, and I've got a wireless cab. And I also have 3 boosters, and the reason for that is the size of my layout is divided into 4 districts. So every district is built the same way. For example, here I'll show you. This is my bus wire. It's a speaker wire, 15 gauge, and so that's what I use for my bus wire. As for my drops, I've got 22 gauge wire, good for 300 volts. Wow. Okay, and it's solid. The other one is, if it's not solid, it's braided. So my bus wire is braided, and my feeders are solid. Once, I don't know if you can see, okay, so what I do, I'm gonna work here. First thing I do is I try to build a section of feeders because they're all going to be grouped under the layout. So I mark everywhere I need to drill. So the tools I use a Dremel. And Dremel. I use knife, wire strippers, and cutters. Those are the only tools I really use. Oh, and a screwdriver, which I forgot. And once under the layout, all my feeders go into one of these. So for example, in this section here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I've got 7 feeders. So what I'm going to do is 2, 4, 6, 7. So this is the one I'm going to use. I could have gotten with other things, but I started with this and never had any problems except for losing a few screws, but that's least of my worries. So once I drill the holes, I make sure I measure my wires so that they all feed at the same place. So if you look at this section here, there's going to be a block right here, about under the table. So all my wires have been measured to reach this block. All my tracks are all wired. I know it's a bit too much, but since I don't like electricity, I want to make sure that all my tracks are wired and I won't have any problems. So even my turnouts are wired, and even the little pieces are wired. So yeah, so all my wires are going to be to that block. So where's my, now I got to find my tools. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so all my tracks are wired, so no problem. And what I do is I just leave about, oh, not much. Oh, great. Just a small piece. And what I do is I curve them towards the tracks so I can do the welding or the soldering. So that, yeah, if I was to redo everything, I would probably wire everything under my tracks and then install my tracks. But now that they're all installed, that's how I do them. And once all the wiring is done, that's when I paint my tracks. So here I've got my solder, yeah, it came from China, but it's very good, and my paste. So what I do is I'll just put a bit of paste here and on the wire. Now, you got to make sure that you don't burn, oh, gee, that you don't burn the ties. Unfortunately, wiring is the part I hate the most. So so I'm going to thin my, I don't know if you can see. And it's as simple as that. What I do with my scenery is if I overdid the soldering, I'll file it and cover it with my ballast, or I'll put some turf like sticking out by the tracks. So that one went well. As for the other one, in the meantime, Ari, is there any questions?
So we do have a general conversation going about which systems you guys are using. So it might be a good one for the end of the show. If you're using NCE or what DCC system you're using, or
Well, in my case, when I got started, I wanted something very easy. So after doing a lot of research and asking questions, the obvious answer was NCE, because it's easy programming, easy this, easy that. And I guess, and as for Digitrax, I was told that you got to know a bit about electronics. So I didn't want to bother with the problems, if you want. So I went NC. I don't know about the others.
I went Digitrex because of NCE. NCE had like a wireless, I think it was a radio at the time, radio antenna, and it didn't turn around the run. So my buddy had an operating system with that, and I saw how it like would drop all the time. So that's why I picked Digitrex. But I know NCE is very flexible as well.
I know that there's a few other parts of NC that I use. But as for the basic wiring, I won't go through all that, but like I've got the MK8 because I'm going to be using push buttons. I got a push button board. It just gets, like it gets really, you could, I'm sure Andy's going to talk about it, but there's so much you can put in electronics. And I saw that NCA had a bunch of them, and there's some compatible ones also.
Absolutely. And I think each of us are going to briefly mention what we're talking about from an electronics perspective, although we're largely talking about the electricity versus electronics here. But what electronics you choose does drive some of that discussion a little bit.
So I've done a set of wires, so I'm ahead of schedule for the month. So once that's done, so I've got, basically what I do is I've got one feeder into one end and jumpers on all the others. And I've got all the feeders that connect on the other side. And that would be, for example, my red wire. Then I've got another one identical for my black wire. It's very, well, with the size of my layout, it's very important that you put the same color of wires on the same side for all your tracks. Because after that, you got to find the problem. So I guess that's it for me. If there's any other questions?
No, I think we're good, boy. Let's show to see what Tim's got working on.
All right, I guess it's my turn. Right now, I've got my lift out section up here. Just because I can't really get under my layout right now very easily. This is the easiest section of my layout to get on. What I usually use is I've got these forceps. I got several different ones, different sizes. So I've got these self-closing needle nose tweezers. Got my die grinders or my rotary tools. Got two different ones. I got the high horsepower one and a little one for cut and track. I can just set it down. It'll set almost flush with the track. I got a diamond encrusted blade for that, doing that. But how I wire up my layout, and I'm doing DCC++ right now. Eventually, I'm going to upgrade that to the ESU cab control system with the mobile control. So what I usually do is I'll take my hobby knife, wire my track, because I'm running 2 buses. I'm running 14, I believe it's 14 gauge wire, braided wire for my bus. And I've got some 22 gauge magnet wire that I use for my feeders. So what I'll do, they'll come in, and let me see where my feeder wires are actually at currently on this one, and I'll take off one of the I can't think right now. The spike head detail on the tie plate with my number, trusty chisel tip. And I'll take my micro drill and I'll drill out right next to the track until I'm through the tie. And then I'll drill the other tie on the opposite side. And sometimes I'll stagger them, sometimes I won't. It just makes it harder to find them when they're staggered. So I'll drill that down through the tie. Then I'll take a piece of piano wire that's roughly the same size as my drill bit, and the drill bit's roughly the same size as my wire. And I'll just shove the piano wire down through. Since I'm on foam, I can just shove it straight down through. Run that through. And then I'll take a piece of my magnet wire. And before I put it in, I will take a pair of flat pliers. And I will actually take and I will smash the end of it and then bend it over. So it forms, I don't know if you can see it or not. Let me get something to put in behind that here. But it forms this little spike head. And I'll cut that to, a length. I could measure it. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I know my wire's right underneath of it. And I'll take and I'll run it down through the hole I made. Pull it on through. Now it's down against the track. Something else I like to use is I use a liquid flux and a insulin syringe. And I'll go in here and I'll apply the flux. Maybe I can actually get squeeze out. So I just put a little dot of flux on there. Is all I need. And I'll take my solder. I use a pretty fine solder. This is 0.81 millimeter. Take my soldering iron. And actually, before I get too far ahead of myself, this is where these come in, the forceps. I'll clamp them onto the rail on both sides of where I'm soldering at. And that will help dissipate the heat so I don't get too hot in one spot. come in and I will solder the spike to it. And then usually I got to change the collet in my die grinder, but I didn't do it this last time. What I'll do is I'll take a wire brush in my die grinder and I'll come back in and I'll buff that off with the die grinder. But for now, we'll use the brass brush. That just cleans it up a little bit, gets the flux off of it. Then to hook it into my bus line, come under the layout, and I'll take my other hobby knife and I'll cut the insulation in a couple spots. And I'll split it. And I'll cut that deep enough. Yeah, then I can pick the insulation off the wire, take and I'll wrap my feeder to it, again with applying flux. And again with the solder. And we'll fill it with solder. Try to heat this up a little bit more because it's still got the coating on the wire, so I got to burn the coating off the wire too. And then we'll trim it, and I got the liquid electrical tape that I'll come back in with and tape it off. So I don't have any problems with short circuits or anything. All right, being a mechanic, I do not like the suitcase connectors. I know a lot of guys do. But from being a mechanic in my field, I despise them. So everything's soldered on my layout. And then we'll trim off the excess.
Why do you hate them so much?
Because they're not weather tight. They corrode. They allow corrosion in.
I mean, they're just a potential point for failure.
That's what I use.
If you're inside a house, they're fine. You know, inside your vehicle, they're usually fine. But everybody wants to use them outside their vehicle for wiring in their lights and stuff like that. Wiring extra lights and stuff like that. And they usually wind up in a couple years corroding and becoming a major source of an electrical problem. Because when you have corrosion, you can create resistance. You get too high a resistance on it, and then you don't have lights working anymore.
I know. That's what I use. Suitcase connectors. I forgot to mention that.
No, you mentioned it, Lloyd, I think. Some people
Since we don't have any questions for Tim, you want to jump over and see what Andy's doing?
Yeah, there's no questions.
Hey, real quick, can you show us what you mean by suitcase connector?
Yeah, hold on.
Yeah.
I just went and got myself.
Suitcase connectors.
As I said, some people call
This
it
is what I use. Those are suitcase connectors.
It's got
I
that
don't know if
spade
you-
in the middle that hooks up two wires together side by side.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got the big one. There's a big hole and a small hole. The small hole is for the drop, and the big hole is for my my bus line. What I do is
Another. Go
I
ahead,
open it up a bit, and I make sure the wires are in, and then I clamp it. I clamp the metal first, and then I close the suitcase.
Another. They make a tool for doing that. For closing that metal, crimping that metal through. Another big problem with those suitcase connectors, a lot of people use the wrong sizes. There's different sizes of those. So they'll clamp like a 16 gauge onto a 12 gauge wire. And when you do that, you actually cut your wires.
Yeah,
You're not
see
just
this.
piercing the insulation, you're cutting your wires also.
Yeah, this one here is for 18 to 14.
$18 to $14, and then what's your small
It's
size?
22. 22.
Probably 18 to 22 gauge on the small size.
This one is, it says here, wire range 18 to 14. And it could be solid or stranded. It doesn't say about the other one. No, it's 8. I presume one is 18, the other one is 14.
It's possible. The bigger one will be the 14 gauge. The smaller hole is supposed to be 18 gauge.
Yeah. But like I said, I started using those about 3 years ago, and touch wood, haven't had any problems yet.
Well, you're inside, like I said. For inside use, they're fine. I just have a personal preference. I don't like.
Here's another alternative to suitcase connectors, where a suitcase connector, most of them, not all depends, does bite the wire, which decreases the size of the wire. So I recommend, if you're using suitcase connectors, to go up one gauge from whatever you think you should use. If you're going to use an 18, use a 16 or something, in case it does break a few of the strands in your stranded wire. However, this, and I don't remember what these are actually called. Okay, it's called lever lock. This is so instead of it being it does not bite the wire. It's a compression fitting. It's also removable and reusable. You just put the wires into there. Now, this works slightly different. You don't put multiple wires, but one wire in each one of them, unless they're really small wires, but you're supposed to. They also make these in, much larger sizes, but it's one complete connector. So much like a barrier strip, it's like a barrier strip with all of the devices connected. So everything's connected. I don't mind suitcase connectors or these, and I use these where some people would use suitcase connectors for what I would consider a temporary and or necessary to remove installation. If it is effectively permanent, then I prefer soldering. Two.
They do make a different style of those Scotch locks, suitcase connectors, whatever you want to call them. There is one that just clamps over one wire and then has a spade connector that goes into the opposite side of it.
All right. So yeah, I mean, I do solder as well for a whole host of reasons, but I'm going to cover a couple things. I'm going to kind of think about this. For me, the most logical way to do it, which means we're going to start on one end and then we're going to go to the other end and then we're going to come back and cover the stuff in the middle, because that's where about the electricity, not the electronics, is some of the most interesting part. So I've showed you guys this when we talked about track work. Mine have feeders dropped, and I use a stranded 22 gauge stranded wire. Although I have been experimenting with using solid, you're not going to be able to see this well enough, but it's just a solid and it's not exactly a magnet wire, probably is, but it's rigid. It's fairly tight. So I can go straight down and then make my solder point immediately. But I have been experimenting with that. So far, I've been using 22 gauge stranded wire, 10, make a little L. It goes on the bottom of the rails, and it goes through a hole. I showed you that when we done the track work stuff on last week's or 2 weeks ago. So if you want to go back and check that out. And then I run my wires along the bottom here. These are an 18 gauge wire that do this feeders. That's for one section of bus. Now, easier to see probably is this. Also, this is going to be street trackage effectively in a parking lot, so it's easier to see. So there's no bus yet. I've just dropped my feeders. I'll put a little bit of I forget what it's called, Beacon 3-in-1, which is as close to hot glue as I can think of, but it doesn't get hot. But it has the similar rubber kind of capacity. So I pull wires down like this. I put a wire on absolutely every rail. I don't use rail joiners, and I use fish plates, as we talked about. Now, so here, this section has a break in the middle. And what I've done for that is where I need a break and electrical break, here I can hide the printed circuit board ties. And then at the ends where this is going to meet with an adjacent module, I also use printed circuit board ties. And this is kind of the way I do my staging trackage as well, because I'm not worried about the cosmetics. When I can hide the track, like in street trackage or under a coal loader where there's, where it's basically dirt up to the top of the rails. I did the same thing here. This is a siding that has dirt all the way up to the rails. In that case, I hid printed circuit ties under it to actually feed the power. When I do that, I put my feeder on the printed circuit tie right on the top of it. It gives me a really solid connector. Using those 22 gauge, goes to the 18. Now let's briefly cover the beginning of this equation. Electronics. As many of you guys know, I do use DCC++. I originally intended to likely buy an NCE system. That's what I was going to do. But I wasn't far enough along that necessarily mattered yet. So I started out with a Sprague and then went to a DCC++ initially so that I could get programming my locomotives. So now I've went to a DCC++, which is just an Arduino board. This is, kind of a different arrangement, but it's just an Arduino with a motor control shield stuck on top. That's it. Simple, cheap as dirt. And I'd always considered for a long time that I would go to an NCE, and given a reason, I would go to an ESU system probably. I think there's an argument for all of the systems depending on your use case. However, I've been completely satisfied with the plus and have no reason to do more than that. This especially come true given a point in just a moment. I'd always planned on building that into an enclosure, basically my plus system. I also use a JMRI system to drive all that. That's a critical part of this equation because with plus, there's no commercially provided throttles. So I built out several JMRI-based systems, and my favorite is basically a Raspberry Pi with a 4-inch display on it, little touch screen, lets me turn the power on and off to the track with this. I actually use the panel Pro component from another computer connected to JMRI over a network, not VNC, not remote desktop, just another instance of JMRI connected to JMRI net. I have been working on building all of this into an enclosure. I'm working on that now. I've got my power supply in it. My system's going to be completely in this enclosure. This will be the entirety of my DCC system. Power vented. I've got circuit breakers and protection on it. That's the basics of electronics. Now with the throttles, that's what has allowed me to go to the proto throttle. I'm committed to using these. Now let's cover the stuff in between, because that's really where it's more interesting. So for me, I need a signaled system. I'm going to operate prototypically or as close as I can, or prototypical like, and I would need occupancy detection also so I can do internet-based remote operating segments, and for signal systems and detection. Detection's critical, and it's pretty imperative that you start and you wire from the beginning with that intention. If you change your mind later, it'd be like building out wiring for DC and then converting to DCC. Lionel Strang probably described this the best when he said when he went from DC to DCC, he did not so much rewire his layout as he unwired his layout because there's so less. So this means a lot when it comes to how you're going to wire for detection. So, all right. See if anybody brought a teacher at Apple today. But let's cover this real quick, but I want you to get the understanding. What I've done currently is I've got my various track buses. Let's assume these are sections. And they'll have multiple feeders tied to the bus. If this is another section, and this is between turnouts, so in this 4-track yard that's back here, or on this section of track work here, this track coming along here will have multiple connectors on it tied to one set of wires. This track will have this siding will have multiple drops. The multiple drops I have tied to another connector, and those will be separate 22 gauge or 18 gauge rather feeders, and those are blocks, much like you had in DC. At the moment, what I have done so far to get my trains running, because I'm worried about that, is I've just pulled those down and tied them together with a wire nut, or these compression connectors. So that lets me wire so that I'm prepared for detection, and I can worry about that later. But what I actually have to do is run these devices, these connectors down and through a detector, a current detector, and then I can tie those together. And then I tie those, so these will be your detectors tied to another bus. This bus will be your detection bus. And then beyond that, we also need power districts. So off of my DCC system, I come off and go through boosters. Maybe a couple of those. So each of those boosters will then produce one circuit. That is one power circuit. We're connected. And that gives me, 5 amps right now on each of those districts. And then I connect between those to my detection blocks. So if this one, I connect through a circuit protector so that I can deal with shorts. And then I may have another set of track tied to this one. And what I'm doing now is putting a booster per level. I'm driving by staging off of the primary booster that is on the motor control shield for the Arduino. And then I'm using an additional Arduino and motor control shield tied in as a second DCC++ that works as a booster or as a slave device. That drives this, that will drive this deck, and then another one driving the top deck. It goes from those power districts through a circuit breaker, up to detection blocks that feeds various districts, and then you go up through each area, like the sections between two turnouts that you need to detect for current load and occupancy detection. So you just got to think about it as like 3 levels deep of wiring instead of a single bus with all the rails tied to it. You can do that. If you don't need signals, by all means do it. If you need signals, you need 2 buses and 3 if you have separate power districts. Those power districts won't be all wired together. So in my case, I have 1 bus that runs around the layout that is this power district. And then from that, I jump off that and go through a current detector and then tie that current detector to an ESP01, which feeds that back to JMRI over Wi-Fi. And we can get into the electronics on a future show. I hope that we will with some of these. These are $2, something like that, $1.50, $2. And this, these devices could detect, well, one of those could tie to 16 current detectors. So you could detect 16 blocks for, $5 plus the current detectors for each of those. But I also do occupancy detection because I put in speakers, these little 1-inch mylars, every couple of feet under the track so that I can do the clacking noises. Now, in the short term, I'm putting these under turnouts now and detecting in the switch to make sure that you don't throw the points under the switch. Since I need that detection to make sure that you don't throw a switch under the train anyway, I can use that detection to fire sound as the trains go across the frog, where they make all that clacking noise that is Florian. I
I
know
got a
there's
question for you, Eddie.
coverage of that, so, but do we have any questions?
Yeah, we got a question for you.
All right.
So, Human City Junction asks, he says he's building a control similar to yours. I don't know if you've seen it. He says he's using a DR5000 instead of the Arduino.
Oh yeah, I have. I followed his channel. I probably need to go get caught up on it again. He's got a really good channel, by the way. Everybody should follow him. But he's doing some DigiKey stuff that I find incredibly interesting with the DigiKey hardware. I probably need to go check that video out in the city. I will, to see the particulars of that. And see what you're doing, because I know you're doing some of the similar things as I am as well. And I am moving away from Arduino for the most part, from Arduino itself. I'm going to eventually have ESP32 systems for basically everything, and everything can feed back over Wi-Fi. And my end goal is dead real anyway. So while this seems complicated, I promise it's not. I have 2 wires running around the lab. Two wires. And then on each module, I break it apart and go into a couple current detectors.
All right, since we don't have any more questions for Andy, let's jump over and see what Robert's working on.
Are you there, Robert?
Yeah, I've been sitting here talking. Apparently, I had myself muted. Jeez Louise. So I am doing DCC++ based off the Arduino boards for my main. So I'm running a main bus line and a accessory bus line under my layout. Tools I use to do that are my tack hammer, drill, pliers. I use 18 gauge wire, red and black for my main, and then I use white and brown for my secondary, my accessory bus, and then some good old fashioned wire strippers and clamps. When it comes to actually hooking things together, I've got little wire holders that I use with the hammer. I've got this terminal strip here. It's completely separated, and makes it really kind of nice and clean and easy to do. I also use insulated male and female quick connectors, and then the little, I don't even know what this one's called, the horseshoe version. That's for sliding into the terminal blocks. As for what's that? Yeah. See, I hesitate. Johnny said it's called a spade connector, and I hesitate to call it a spade connector because that's the spade to me is the one that's like full all the way through.
That's a
But
blade.
it probably has the same name.
No, the one's a blade.
The full one's blade, and the other one's a spade. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you for the clarification there. See, I don't know everything. I'm just winging it, right? The other thing I just started using for my bus is my staple gun here. The idea behind that is to keep my wire nice and tight on the end so that where it connects to the second section or the next section, it's nice and firm. And if I need to unhook it, the wire's not going to shoot all the way back to the back of the section I'm working on. This half is pretty much all for my bus wire here. This little piece here is what I pretty much use for all my feeders. So my feeders are 24 gauge wire. This is a tap splice connector. It's similar to a suitcase. The main wire comes through here, but it closes over on itself, and then I can put the
Blade.
What was it again, Tim? The full one?
Blade.
The blade connector. I could put a blade connector in like this
Those are the ones
and
I was
actually
talking
make
about
my
a while ago.
connection. The
Those
tap
are
splice.
the ones I was talking about earlier.
See, this to me is not a suitcase connector. I mean, some people might call it that, but I don't consider this a suitcase connector. I like them. They work pretty good. They're pretty quick for the layout. Of course, Tim's the mechanic. I'm not. Another tool I use is my drill with I think it's a 9-inch drill bit on it. That'll gives me plenty of access to go through 4 or 5 inches of foam and have some left over. The other thing I use is a tool that I kind of made myself out of necessity. And it's basically just a 12. I think it's 12-inch skewer that I've taken the end out of. I've split the end on it so that I can pinch a wire in there and run it down through the hole that I drilled. So I'm going to switch camera angles here real quick and show you how I drop my feeders. All right. So I'm going to mute myself because this thing is really loud and really obnoxious. So hold tight.
Well, I'm sorry. We had a power outage and briefly, which just takes the internet down. So I had to connect back real quick. Just a little flicker. It's lightning and storming, though. And of course, it lightens and storms the one night when we have a live show and I need it to work for an hour straight. But
all right.
Are you using?
So now I've got.
Are you using that?
Now
kind
I've got
of
my holes for my feeders. Yeah. Hold on here, Andy. Hold on. Don't run me over, buddy. Jeez Louise.
Right.
All right. So now I don't know if you guys can see it very well, but I've got this split in this skewer. So I just run the feeder down in there, the feeder wire down there. And I just use that to kind of guide myself through. The cool thing is that it actually holds. So now I can reach it from the bottom of the layout and pull it all the way through. There I'm through. Now I just kind of figure out where my bus is. Give me a little bit extra just to be safe. And snip it off. All right, so there's that. Now, what I do, move that thing out of the way for me. There we go. Now, this is a trick that Ralph taught me, and thank you, Ralph, for this. Strip the end of the wire off. Grab a pair of proper pliers. So where I've got this wire straight, what I'm going to do is take the pliers at the end of it, hold it parallel to the wire, bend it over to make a 90 degree. Can you guys see that, or is it too small? Okay. And then so once I've got it in an L shape. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bend it 90 degrees the other direction. So I've got it parallel to the track now. Now I'm going to bend it in towards the track. So now what I've got is a wire. Let's see if I can do it out of this. So I've got it up like coming out of the thing like this is the road bed. It's coming up. So what I do is I bend it over this direction, get an L shape in it, and then I bend it one more time, giving me this sort of a shape. What that lets me do is feed this back down, pull it in snug, and it gives me more wire. And I just put it right there above the rail joiner. And I just let it sit there for a few minutes. I'm gonna heat up my solder gun. All right.
Don't bump your arm.
Hit it with just a touch of flux. And normally I don't do this over a rail joiner. I'm doing it this time just because I'm trying to be quick with it, and I'll have to come back and clean it off later. And the trick is to make sure that the wire is up nice and tight against the rail, against the web of the rail.
Yeah, if you don't clean your flux off, it'll corrode.
Little bit of flux. Then I just use the pliers to push it against there, nice and tight, and just hit it. There we go. That one's done. So then basically after that, it's just a matter of rinse and repeat and keep on going through. What it looks like when I've got it pulled down and tight Switch these cameras again. Go to number 2. So here's where I did the solder. The joint's a little big, but once I hit it with spray paint, you'll never even see it. It'll hide in pretty good. And then I just go through and do that on both sides. I make sure to hit every track, every full length piece of track that I've got, even in the corners and the curves and things like that, all the way around. It's all about redundancy at this point. I'm hoping that I can get one more in. If I can get this, other ground in there, maybe I can actually kick on the railroad and run a train up to this point. It'll give me will be one step closer to being a looper.
What are you guys using to clean up your flux?
So I use rubbing alcohol to clean my flux.
Same here.
Yeah, rubbing alcohol's okay. Works, does the job. Most of the time I do that too. I'll use the natured alcohol if I'm working with a lot of flux or something. If I'm making like joints where I've soldered to a circuit board or something, there's a lot of surface area. I use the natured for that, but
For those of you that can't hear Johnny, he just popped off in our ears and says, "I just spit on it."
that was a pretty good Johnny, actually.
I've been practicing.
I noticed that. I could tell.
The cool thing about Ralph's trick is, as long as you get the 2 bins in the proper sequence, if it's backwards or whatever, it'll still work. You just solder it on the back side instead of the forward side.
Now, one thing so far all of us have failed to mention is when you're soldering your feeders, make sure you're on the outside of your rail.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie to you, Tim. I kind of thought that was a no dub, but yeah, you're probably right. We probably should have mentioned that.
Well, I'm doing that
as
wrong.
you can see, I'm doing everything on the outside.
Then I'm doing that wrong.
Well,
Why does that not surprise me?
I had to be different. It has to be something different. I go on the bottom.
Yeah.
But don't get me wrong. That trick that Ralph uses
Well,
that I think came from Andy Sporadio of Modern Rotor fame, making the little spike head detail, making it basically a spike head, that's spectacular. That's a great trick.
Hey guys, we don't have any more questions for Robert, so if you want to open it up for general discussion, and we can do that.
Yeah.
Sure.
What are we hearing so far?
A lot of people asking about if they're having trouble getting alcohol for their fluxes just because of the COVID stuff. And
Oh, that's a disaster. I mean, basically, I
actually went to the Dollar Tree today to look for some, because I can usually actually get 91% at the Dollar Tree. And yeah, they didn't have any. They didn't even have any 50, nothing.
Me either. I haven't been able to, and I actually have looked into and watched some videos on distillation to try to figure it out. And you just can't make IPA at home. You can make ethyl alcohol or something. Obviously, that's a steel or moonshine. That doesn't help me. I've because I just bought a 3D printer. I bought an ultrasonic cleaner so I could use mead green, just because of the alcohol problem. Effectively, although I think that's one of the better purchases I've made. But so I'm looking at substitutes for alcohol, and in just a minute, I even recently bought a new surfactant to make wet water because, again, can't get alcohol. And I've used alcohol for everything. I don't use water and dish soap normally.
I stocked up long before this COVID stuff hit.
And I don't know if this is stating the obvious, but with your electrical solder, make sure that it's designed for electrical, because the stuff that you use for plumbing is also corrosive.
Yes.
It will damage your wiring over the long term.
Make sure your solder and your flux are both for electrical or electronic, not plumbing flux or solder.
Well, you know, I have to disagree with you on that one, Tim.
It will work.
This is what I'm using for.
Yeah, it will
This
work.
is the flux paste I'm using, and it's a regular paste. I mean, it's nothing fancy. It holds a great connection. I just got to make sure to clean it real well.
And I did find this camping stove fuel, which is denatured alcohol. It's the only alcohol I could find in the store, and it's the same thing. It's just denatured alcohol with a different brand on it. But you might want to go check in a camping section. Although people are, not everybody, there's plenty of people who know that same trick, but you can get some alcohol to buy it that way.
Walmart in the camping section and in the paint thinners, because that same bottle right there is in the paint thinner section.
Right, absolutely. So, and this is one thing, like for cleaning up these solder joints. Just alcohol is what we need in order to do that, basically. But I also bought this stuff for other purposes, for scenery and stuff. So now I'm not using alcohol for that either, because we can't get alcohol.
That's the great thing about being in this hobby, man. You have to be resourceful too. Keep it cheap and get it where you can.
I also have a brief trick that I might teach you guys that might save people some trouble too. You need a multimeter or whatever you want to call this thing. You can put this thing on the continuity check. Put it on the continuity setting so it'll ding when you knock them together, basically. And while I'm running wire on the layout, I'll basically take the connectors and shove them under the rails at the points of the ties where you can on both sides, and just leave it connected like that. And I'll just work around the layout wiring. And if I ever make a mistake and connect the wrong wire, I get a little ding right then. And that's where my mistake was at that very second.
Well, see, my problem with that is mine's got a battery saver in it. So after so many minutes, my voltmeter or multimeter shuts off. It'll sit there and it'll give me an alarm and then shut off.
Andy, is that while there's current going through your tracks?
No, you don't need. Well, when I'm running feeders or I run the feeders separately. When I'm connecting all my feeders to my buses and connecting my buses up, I don't have any system on at all. I mean, it may even not be connected. But when I'm dropping my wires and connecting up the track modules, basically, I just start setting things in place, start wiring stuff together, start getting ready to solder them. So I twist them around the wires. If I make that mistake, I'll get that buzz or that bell, that notification letting me know I've made a mistake before I go solder it. Because I do the same thing Tim does. I pull the insulation back, twist it around the solder, and then use the electrical tape.
Lloyd, because what I was going to say is that once I've done a section, I'll put the power on, and I'm going to use an LED, like an LED with 2 wires, and I'll just put them on the tracks to make sure that the light goes on, so I know I've got my wiring is done.
That works pretty well for sure. The only problem in my case is I could easily make that mistake because and it would take me a long time to chase down where it is. It may not even short because I insulate every rail. Every rail is wired and electrically isolated. So boy, it would be really hard to chase down. And I know I've had people on here in our nightly hangouts go through and wire half the layout. There was a gentleman who went through and wired half the layout, and he had ultimately made the mistake and wired 2 wires that were very close together, coming down as a turnout went together. They were close together. He pulled the wrong wire and connected it. He basically had to unwire 3/4 of that layout or go through and cut his bus in various places to slowly narrow it down.
And on a continuity test, you don't want power on your layout. You want it, and you want it disconnected from your DCC system, because continuity test can sense all the way back through your DCC system and get a circuit.
Yeah, and I believe in physical breaks. physical switches. And while I do use the DCC++, or you could use the JMRI power to turn your layout on and off, whether you have Digitrax or NCE, you can still use that to turn track power on. I also have a physical power switch on the pre-power, and I have a physical power between my system and the rail, a physical break.
And if you don't have continuity test and you want to use an ohm setting just to check it, make sure it keeps staying as an out of limits or over 1K ohm. You definitely do not want power on your layout, because if there's power on your layout, it will read a circuit.
Well, and the impedance tester, or the ohm meter, basically uses the battery that's inside of this thing to put some electricity. So you're also adding that additional power. There's a chance that you can damage your multimeter. Now, we are working with fairly low voltages here, low currents. So it may be less likely that you would damage it, but you sure won't get good results or good data.
Now, you may find that it fluctuates quite a bit.
That's right. But that little bell trick with using the continuity meter, it's a spectacular trick, I think. I've used it for years. It's not my trick. It's somebody else's trick.
Ralph says to make a buzzer with a 9-volt battery and use that to check your switches. If it shorts out, it'll buzz.
Yeah. Get a piezoelectric buzzer.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, actually, that'd be easier than the multimeter or whatever, like yours that cuts off. I would like to make one of those. Probably should. And even if you're building like fast track switches, I don't know that you could do that, but if you could, then you could, hook those two, and as you're soldering everything down, that way you make sure you get a break. But
let's talk about that after the show, Andy, because I have an idea on how to do something like that.
Okay. All right, we'll figure that out.
Involves a piece of PC board or PC tie, the 9-volt battery, and then piezoelectric buzzer.
Yep, I've got a bunch of piezoelectric buzzers. All right, we'll do that. There's a bunch of these little tricks that you need, but what you want to do is you want to figure out, if you're wiring a layout, you either want to do one thing at a time, make sure it's right, and move on, which could be quite slow, or as you progress down, you surely want to catch your errors earlier in the set. Whether you use this trick that somebody taught me about or some other technique, because it's very easy to short those two together, especially if you're doing the stuff like I'm doing, or like anybody basically that has a signaled or detected layout. You've got these various buses. Boy, your problem could be anywhere in the system. Of course, with different buses, where the choice is, you can very easily isolate your sections electrically to solve problems. All right, do we have any more?
Any more questions or discussions going on that we need to address?
Well, just to Andy's point real quick, and then we can go ahead and wrap this thing up for the night. I usually go through and do all my bus wire first, and get it all the way as far as I'm going to do it, on whatever half of the layout I'm working on, and then I go back through and work on my feeders. And I usually will do all my reds at one time and then come back and do all my blacks at another time to make sure I don't make a mistake.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, that's another good point. The color coding is another good point as well. I would recommend color coding. I use white and black for the power district buses, and then like green and red for the local connectors. And it's a good idea to develop substandard. There's no right or wrong about this. Do whatever you want. Just create a standard, write it down, and stick with it.
Exactly. I was going to just say that. Make sure you write it down, because that way or somebody comes in to help you, they know what your standard is.
Yep. And a good idea is write it down. Actually, here's a neat thing that I've done for some of my IT networking stuff lately is I found some paper. I think I bought it on Amazon, but you could get a printer paper that is a peel away. It's a big sticker. It's an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that's a sticker. And I print that out off the computer or whatever and stick it at the, wherever all your system is at. So, you may wire your layout up and not rewire anything for 10 years.
Or a Dymo label printer.
Yeah, I have an Epson version of that, and I mean, I am just obsessive compulsive enough to have a serious love affair with my label printer. I really like that thing at much more than I'm comfortable with admitting, actually. All right. So if we don't have any more questions, we do have we have the next show will be coming up in 2 weeks on the 11th. We're going to talk about terrain. I've covered a little bit of that stuff since part of my construction, but we'll talk about the various techniques that we all use. You know, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the ground goop, and Ralph will get to pick on me a little bit about how I don't like to get dirty while doing it. That'll be a good show. Of course, we'll have Johnny's show coming up next week as well. Also, if you guys have any questions, if you're watching this after the fact, or if you have any questions that go into any of this in more detail, or talk about the electronics end of things that we're not specifically covering this season, you can send us an email to any of us individually at just our first names at, Andy at, Robert at, Tim at, Lloyd at modelroutinglive.com. So, or you can send one to our group for the show at empires at modelroutinglive.com. And we'll answer it at the beginning of one of the next upcoming shows. Or if it involves something we're not going to cover or the electronics part, we can reply to your email there. Also, you could ask any questions. You can send us questions via Facebook, of course. We have a community there. Please join us over there. Or you can ask any questions or comment in the comments to this YouTube video. And we do read all of those, and we'll either reply to it or bring it up at the beginning of the next show. Speaking of that, please subscribe to us if you're not already. Hit the bell. That way you get notified about these upcoming shows. And, and like it if you like it or not. But we sure like to see that. It does encourage us. We do get excited about seeing those. So
if you don't like it,
thanks
down. That way we know you're there.
Exactly. Let us know what we're doing. I mean, if we're doing it wrong, let us know. I mean, I personally love criticism. You don't get better without criticism. If any of you guys think some of the things I'm doing aren't the right way to do it, this is, speaking of that, this show is all about it. We've stressed that significantly. This show is about how we are building them. By all means, I want to learn if you have tricks or techniques or criticisms. And this is not none of these ways we're doing it. As you can see, all four of us are doing these things somewhat differently. All of us using different systems. By all means, this is how each of us have made our decisions. You'll make your own, but we want to share with you what has worked for each of us. And thank you guys very much for joining us on this edition of the Empire Show, Railroading Empires. And we look forward to seeing you guys again in 2 weeks.
See you, everybody.